And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A former police commander accused of overseeing the torture of more than 100 African-American men goes on trial today in Chicago. Former Lieutenant Jon Burge is accused of lying when he denied in a civil lawsuit that he and other detectives had tortured anyone. He faces a maximum of 45 years in prison if convicted of all charges. The accusations of torture date back 40 years, but Burge has avoided prosecution until now. For nearly 2 decades, beginning in 1971, Burge was at the epicenter of what's been described as the systematic torture of dozens of black men to coerce confessions. In total, more than 100 people in Chicago say they were subjected to abuse, including having guns forced into their mouths, suffocation with bags placed over their heads, and electric shocks inflicted on their genitals. The police department fired Burge in 1993 for mistreatment of a suspect, but did not press charges. A decade later, then Illinois Governor George Ryan released 4 men on death row. He said Burge had extracted confessions from using torture. Public outcry eventually led Cook County to appoint 2 special prosecutors to look into the allegations. In 2006, prosecutors found there was evidence to show beyond a reasonable doubt that torture had occurred, but the statute of limitations had expired. 2 years ago, federal prosecutors finally brought charges against Burge, though not for torture. They say he lied in a civil suit about the torture, and they've charged him with perjury and obstruction of justice. The trial is expected to last 6 weeks. We go now to Chicago, where we're joined by 2 guests. Darrell Cannon, one of dozens of men to come forward with allegations of abuse at the hands of the Chicago police. Darrell says police tortured him in 1983 and forced him to confess to a murder he didn't commit. He spent more than 20 years in prison, but after a hearing on his tortured confession, prosecutors dismissed his case in 2004. Now he's suing Chicago for wrongful conviction. We're also joined by Flint Taylor, an attorney with the People's Law Office in Chicago. He's represented many of the torture victims and was directly involved in spearheading the special prosecutor's investigation. Flint Taylor, let's begin with you. Just lay out the scope of what is about to happen today in a Chicago courtroom.
Well, it's very significant what's finally happening decades after it should have. This trial, although it will not deal with allegations of torture itself, will deal with obstruction of justice and perjury. The reason that it won't deal with the crime of torture itself is because the mayor of the city of Chicago, who at that time was the chief prosecutor, Richard Daley, back in 1982, when evidence was presented to him that definitively showed that there was police torture under Burge and by Burge, he chose not to prosecute Burge and not to move to have him released from the police department, but rather continued to prosecute men for many years after that who had been falsely accused of torture. Darrell Cannon here, my client, was tortured in 1983. If Daley had moved in 1982 with the evidence he had to remove Burge from the police force and prosecute him for torture, we would not have Darrell Cannon spending 20, 25 years behind bars and not having him tortured by electric shock. So the real crime here started many years ago with the cover-up, a cover-up that was engineered by the mayor himself and his first assistant at that time, who went on to be the chief prosecutor, Richard Devine. That really is the background to why we are having this prosecution now only for obstruction of justice and perjury rather than for the crime against humanity, which is torture.
Go back to 1971. Can you reconstruct what began then, Flint Taylor?
Certainly. Burge was at a POW camp in Vietnam in the late 60s. Of course, in Vietnam, we now know there was electric shock used on people in POW camps, Vietnamese prisoners. At that time, it appears that Burge learned the techniques that he brought back to Chicago. In 1972, he became a detective at the Southside police station where they interrogated suspects, almost predominantly African-American suspects. In 1973, we first hear of the first victim of torture. That man was tortured with electric shock, with a bag over his head, beaten, and into a false confession. From that point forward, the cases started to stack up through the 70s, 80s, and all the way to 1991. At the same time, Burge had moved from detective to sergeant to lieutenant in charge of the violent crimes unit to commander of an entire police area. So as the cases of torture increased, he continued to be promoted, and more people, not just detectives, but supervisors, and subsequently, as I mentioned, prosecutors, the chief prosecutor, the superintendent of police, successive superintendents, they all came to know what was going on, and their response to it was, rather than to stop the scandal, stop the systematic torture, was to promote Burge. And only when the evidence mounted too high, there were 2 public trials, and the community became so outraged and demanded that Burge be fired that anything was done. But to this day, and until 2 years ago, there were no charges. And in fact, the special prosecutor that you mentioned in your piece actually issued a whitewash report, and in fact said the statute of limitations barred prosecution, when of course the U.S. attorney found otherwise.
Of course, torture is an extremely serious charge. As you said, it violates national and international law. But I'm surprised that just for obstruction of justice and for perjury, he faces 45 years in prison.
Well, that's the statute of limitations problem, and one of the there's many unaddressed issues in Chicago. We are very pleased that Burge is being prosecuted, but there's much left to do, and that includes dealing with federal and state statutes, legislation that would make torture a specific crime. And since it's a crime against humanity, there would be no statute of limitations, like there is no statute of limitations for genocide or murder. And in that instance, in the future, if there were another Burge or other torture, another torture ring, and it were covered up successfully for many years, then he could still, or they could still be prosecuted for torture. And that is a major issue that's still being dealt with by the activists here in the city of Chicago, along with the fact that 20 or 25 men are not as fortunate, and I put quotes around fortunate, as Darrell has been, to be out now. And those men are still behind bars so many decades later because of tortured confessions. And we're fighting those cases one by one. But in fact, all those men should be given new trials, and there should be new trials without the tortured evidence, obviously. And the other aspect that we feel very strongly about are the men, the henchmen that worked under Burge, and that includes the 2 right-hand men of Burge, self-admittedly, who tortured Darrell at the remote torture site. Those men have yet to be charged. Now, there's an ongoing investigation into their perjury and obstruction of justice, but to this point, they haven't been indicted for the scores of cases where men have said that they tortured them. So there's much unfinished business, as well as there's many victims and survivors of police torture here in the city of Chicago who have received no compensation because of a similar statute of limitations in civil cases. So we feel that...
We're going to come back to this discussion in a minute. Flint Taylor, an attorney with the People's Law Office in Chicago, has represented a number of men who say they were tortured by Jon Burge, the police commander who's going on trial today. We'll also hear from Darrell Cannon, who